The wind screamed across the blasted wastelands of Tyro's Fort, pulling ash and dust in endless spirals that danced around the cracked bones of ancient cities and broken towers and shattered monuments to a long-dead empire. And I moved carefully through the wreckage, my boots crunching over fractured synth glass and charred stone, my breath shallow inside the filter mask, as my eyes scanned the horizon for movement or shadow or sign. Because no one came here, not anymore, not after the wars, not after the skies turned red and stayed that way for decades. And yet here I was with a map in my hand and a signal in my ear, and the pull of something deep in my chest that felt older than memory. The signal had begun 3 days ago, repeating every 6 hours on a band. No human tech should be using a pulse of rhythm and sound that turned into coordinates, and then silence. And I followed it, not because I believed in ghosts or legends, but because I had nothing left to lose and maybe something to find. And as the sunless sky cracked open with distant thunder, I reached the final hill and looked down into a crater where the last battle of the first contact war had ended and where something moved among the wreckage. It was tall, armored in obsidian plating that shimmered like wool under dead light, its stance graceful yet taut with tension, its gaze sharp and focused. And as it turned to face me, I felt the weight of 1,000 histories crash into my chest. And still I stepped forward without raising my hands, without a word, because something in its posture had changed. And its weapon, a massive glaive covered in alien script, trembled slightly in its hand before falling to the ash below with a sound that echoed far too long. The silence stretched like a taut wire between us, humming with a frequency not heard, but felt in bone and blood, and I stood motionless, unsure whether to speak or flee. But then, the alien combatant stepped forward slowly, with the poise of a warrior and the care of someone approaching a long-lost sacred thing. And I could see her eyes now, glowing faintly beneath the helm's retracting plates. And those eyes did not speak of conquest or threat or duty, but of something else, something like awe or disbelief. Her hand reached out, not to harm, but to show, and from a compartment in her armor, she withdrew something wrapped in star-woven cloth, faded from age and travel. And when she unraveled it, my breath caught in my throat, for it was a photo, an old terrestrial print with the corners frayed and the surface worn from touch and on. It was me, or rather a younger version of me, staring out with that half smile I'd forgotten how to make, wearing a jacket I hadn't owned in years and standing in front of the diner back home that burned down 2 winters ago. "This cannot be," I whispered, but she only looked at me with something too layered to name, and then in a voice like shattered glass, reassembled into melody, she said, "We finally found you." And I felt my knees weaken, not from fear, but from the sudden tidal wave of memory and confusion, and the impossible sense that my life had always been leading to this moment. The crater around us seemed to vanish as her words sank into my skin and stirred echoes that were not mine, or perhaps had always been mine, hidden deep beneath the layers of who I thought I was. And I stared at the photo again, wondering how it could exist in her hands, wondering how she could have found it in me, and what she meant by we and found. And I tried to ask, but she raised a hand, not to silence, but to guide, and turned toward the northern edge of the crater, where a structure lay half buried in slag and scorched stone. We walked together, the distance shrinking under strange stillness. And when we reached it, I saw that the structure was no building, but a vessel older than anything I had ever seen, with lines carved by design, not aesthetic, and symbols etched in patterns that tugged at some dormant part of my brain. And she placed her palm against a recessed panel, and a door hissed open, revealing a corridor pulsing with light and presence. Inside the ship, the air felt alive, heavy with something sacred, and I followed her past rooms filled with relics and terminals, and then into a chamber where a sphere hovered above a pedestal surrounded by rotating rings of metal and light. And she touched the sphere, and images erupted into the air. Not just images, but memories or simulations or records of a war that spanned galaxies. and ended in fire and blood, and the image of a man standing between two warring fleets, his hands raised, his face calm, his voice lost in the noise, and that man was me. The chamber dimmed and the images faded, leaving only the hum of the sphere and her gaze, fixed on me as if seeing every version of who I had been or might have been, across lives uncounted. And she said, your essence is not native to this cycle, your form is recent, but your imprint predates even the archives, and we carried the hope that your recurrence would align with our era, and now that you are here, the balance may shift once more. I tried to understand, tried to ask how or why or what she wanted from me, but every time I opened my mouth, the questions died on my tongue, replaced by a rising certainty that I had known her before in a dream, or a dream of a dream that came to me in fever or silence, and I asked her finally what I was, but who she was, and her answer rang through me like thunder under ocean. I am Kale Tivan, daughter of the third wave, general of the morning suns, and your guardian, bound by blood and vow across time to protect you until your path resumes and your voice speaks again into the fracture. And I dropped to one knee, not because I meant to, not because I believed her, but because my body remembered something my mind did not, and I wept without knowing why. The days that followed were not measured by sun or sleep, but by memory and motion, and she taught me the ways of the vessel and the languages it carried and the symbols that had once ruled empires. And as I learned, I felt old layers peel away like bark from a fire tree, and beneath them, something new or ancient began to stir, until my dreams became filled with stars and voices and a throne of molten glass that no one dared approach except me. Others came too, emissaries from distant places, drawn by the same pulse that had drawn me, and they came in peace or war or fear, and Kale stood beside me for each, and I began to speak in tongues I had never learned, yet knew by instinct, and they listened, and they believed or feared or obeyed, and still, I did not understand fully what I was or what I would become, only that the tides of something vast were turning again, and my presence was the fulcrum. Then came the night when the ship began to sing, and Kale knelt before me, her hands upon her knees, her eyes reflecting galaxies I could not name, and she said, the fracture is near, and the voices are waiting, and your return must be chosen, not claimed. And I stood with the photo in my pocket and the memory of a diner and a life that felt borrowed, and I stepped into the core and the ship became light. I saw it then, all of it, not in sequence or logic, but in waves that crashed and receded and surged again. I saw lives I had lived and ones I had not, faces I had worn, and names that had carried weight across thousands of worlds, and in each I had been a seed of peace, or war, or change, and the echoes of those paths had drawn this moment into being, not as destiny, but as consequence and choice. I spoke not with voice, but with will, and the sphere answered, and the ship rose from Tyros 4, breaking the ash and the crust, and the weight of history, and when it emerged, the stars responded, opening paths sealed since the collapse of the last era. And through those gates we traveled, Kale and I and those who followed, not as rulers, not as saviors, but as witnesses to the return of a presence that had shaped what had been, and now would shape what must come. And still, carry the photo, faded and frayed, and proof that even across lifetimes and galaxies, some part of us remembers who we were, and who we might become. And as I look at Kale, at her eyes still full of stormlight and sorrow, I know that her words that day still echo in my bones and in the void. We finally found you, and in finding me, they found their future. And maybe, so did I.